Welcome back, everyone.
Hey there, glad to be here.
Welcome to the 7th episode of our Diplomacy and International Relations Summer Series.
Hard to believe we're already on episode 7.
I know, right? Time flies. And for everyone listening, especially the HF and gymnasium students or any practitioners tuning in, make sure to follow and subscribe.
Definitely.
And also, you can subscribe to us on Patreon. It really helps keep this deep dive running. And you actually gain access to extra episodes.
Yeah, and don't forget the weekly and monthly briefings on Danish politics we do on there.
Exactly. The Patreon link is right down in the description. So let's jump in.
Let's do it.
When you picture global power, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Oh, usually, president standing at podiums.
Right. Or
Yeah.
prime ministers negotiating behind closed doors. Or maybe massive multinational corporations leveraging just like billions of dollars across continents.
Yeah, the classic heavyweights.
We're so conditioned to view the world as this rigid chessboard of flags, militaries, and state borders. But today's deep dive into the source material is about an entirely different kind of power structure. One that's operating right in front of us.
An invisible web, basically.
Exactly. An invisible web of ordinary people, local activists, labor unions, and transnational networks. And they are quietly bypassing those massive governments to rewrite international law.
Which is wild when you think about it.
It is. It operates kind of like the dark matter of the political universe.
Ooh, I like that analogy.
Right. You can't always see it on a standard map, not the way you see a nation-state with a capital city. But its gravitational pull holds international movements together.
And it completely alters the trajectory of global policies.
Yes. So our mission today is to unpack this dark matter and to connect this to our previous episode in the summer series where we talked about formal international organizations like the UN and the WTO today is all about the informal transnational civic actors.
The folks operating outside the official government buildings.
Exactly. So what actually is this global civil society?
Well, just like astrophysicists debating dark matter, political theorists have spent decades arguing over what this space actually is.
And who controls it?
Right. And whether its influence is, fundamentally a force for human liberation or just a subtle mechanism of control.
Because we all know the basic players, right? Like we know what NGOs are.
Sure.
We know about think tanks, faith-based groups, social movements.
Yeah, the usual suspects.
But looking at the sources, the underlying friction isn't really about identifying who they are. It's about interpreting their fundamental purpose.
Exactly. It really depends on the political lens you're wearing. You can view a human rights NGO or an environmental think tank in wildly different ways.
So let's break that down. The sources talk about 4 distinct theoretical lenses, right?
Yeah, 4 main ones.
Yeah.
To understand how the world operates, you kind of have to look through each of them.
Okay, lay them on me. Let's start with the liberal perspective.
So, in liberal democratic theory, global civil society is viewed as the ultimate bottom-up contributor to the legitimacy of the international system.
Basically, the people holding power to account.
Exactly. When a state signs an international treaty on, say, climate change, the liberal perspective argues that it's the environmental NGOs and the citizen watchdogs who actually make sure the state keeps its promises.
They view this space as a crucial pillar of global democracy.
Right. Democracy in action.
Okay, I have to push back on that entirely.
Oh, go for it.
If we are talking about democracy, the core mechanism is electoral representation.
Right. Voting.
I don't go to a ballot box to vote for the executive director of Greenpeace,
No, you don't?
or the head of Amnesty International, or the board members of some massively funded think tank. These organizations are entirely unelected,
That is very true.
and some of them are funded by billionaires with highly specific ideological agendas. So calling unelected groups with massive lobbying power democracy in action feels like a stretch.
You're not wrong to point that out.
It feels like an oligarchy wearing a humanitarian mask, honestly.
And that right there is the definitive critique of the liberal view. It brings us to a really crucial distinction in the text, the difference between democratic representation and democratic accountability.
Okay, unpack that for me.
So you're totally correct that these groups lack traditional representation. They don't have a mandate from a popular vote.
Right.
But the liberal defense argues that democracy isn't merely about holding elections. It's about checking centralized power.
Checking the power.
Think about the structure. Global institutions like the World Bank or the World Trade Organization, They're already insulated from direct democratic election.
Yeah, nobody votes for the head of the WTO either.
Exactly. So if civil society didn't exist, the only entities monitoring those massive global institutions would be state bureaucrats.
I see.
Civil society provides democratic accountability by acting as an independent alarm system. They track corporate behavior, leak documents, publish independent data.
And expose when the powerful violate international norms.
Right. They may not be elected,
Yeah.
but they enforce the transparency that makes democracy actually function.
So they aren't the elected government, but they are sort of like the immune system reacting to the government's infections.
That's a great way to put it.
I can see the logic, even if the funding structures still feel a bit murky to me. But let's move to the second lens, the realist perspective. I know they take a much darker view of all this.
Oh, yeah. The realist perspective is purely cynical regarding civil society.
How so?
Well, realism argues that the international system is basically an anarchy, where nations just compete for survival and dominance.
You call it eat dog.
Exactly. In this framework, global civil society doesn't even exist as an independent, benevolent force.
Right, they think it's fake.
Not fake, just instrumental.
Mm-hmm.
Realists interpret NGOs and transnational networks as mere tools of statecraft.
Tools used by powerful states.
Right. To project soft power and advance their own national interests abroad.
Okay, walk us through the mechanics of that. How does a powerful state weaponize an ostensibly independent organization?
Think about the flow of capital and this concept of democracy promotion.
All right.
A wealthy, powerful nation might allocate millions of dollars in grants to fund, say, independent journalism or human rights groups in a rival nation.
To a liberal, that's supporting civil society.
But to a realist, that is a calculated geopolitical strategy to destabilize a rival regime from within.
Wow. So the powerful state uses the NGO to popularize ideas that serve its own strategic interests.
Exactly, all operating under the guise of an independent grassroots movement. The realist views civil society as just another proxy battlefield for great power competition.
That makes a terrifying amount of sense. If you want to undermine a foreign government, you don't send in the military, you fund an insurgency of ideas.
Precisely, through a network of think tanks and local activists.
Okay, what about the Marxist perspective?
So the Marxist lens looks past the state and focuses entirely on class and capital.
Naturally.
Marxists don't see global civil society as a tool for statecraft. They see it as a political vanguard.
Vanguard, like revolutionaries.
Sort of. To understand this, we have to look at cultural hegemony.
The idea that the ruling class maintains control by dominating the culture and moral norms, not just the police and military.
Yes, you've got it. Marxists view civil society organizations as the battlefield for this hegemony.
So how do they view the NGOs?
Well, it's a split. On one hand, elite-funded NGOs might be seen as maintaining the capitalist status quo. They just offer band-aid solutions to systemic inequalities.
To keep people from revolting.
Right. But on the other hand, radical social movements and global labor unions are viewed as counter-hegemonic forces.
Forces that exist to spread a different worldview and build class consciousness.
Exactly, to fundamentally challenge the dominant global capitalist order.
So the liberal sees a watchdog, the realist sees a geopolitical weapon, and the Marxist sees either a capitalist pacifier or a revolutionary vanguard.
That covers the major Western political theories, yeah.
But the sources highlight a fourth lens, which kind of suggests this entire conversation might be structurally flawed from the jump.
Right, the non-Western critique.
This one is fascinating.
It really is. This perspective argues that the very premise of our conversation, the idea that you can carve human society into neat, distinct boxes labeled state, market, and civil society, is a uniquely Western post-Enlightenment construct.
Because it relies on the historical separation of church and state and public versus private spheres.
Exactly. And the critique suggests that this framework fails entirely when you apply it to many societies in the global south, the Middle East, or parts of Asia.
Places where the boundaries between family, religion, the market, and the state are just deeply intertwined.
Yeah. So when Western institutions try to force this model onto non-Western countries demanding they develop a vibrant civil society as a condition for receiving financial aid.
It backfires.
Totally. It often results in the creation of these artificial Western-facing organizations that have zero actual connection to the local culture.
It's like they're building
A Hollywood set.
Yes, a Hollywood set of an NGO just to satisfy a European donor.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
It's a massive structural flaw. But regardless of which lens you look through, This dark matter has undeniably gained massive influence over the last 40 years.
Undeniably.
And the sources pinpoint the late 20th century as this perfect storm for transnational activism. It seems to center around a very specific logistical shift, starting with the 1992 UN Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro.
A Rio Earth Summit. A massive turning point.
Why did a single environmental conference become the big bang for global civil society?
To understand that, you have to look at the logistics of activism before 1992.
Okay, set the scene.
Prior to Rio, you had thousands of brilliant, dedicated environmental and social justice groups operating in complete silos.
Like totally disconnected from each other.
Yeah. An indigenous rights group in Brazil was fighting local loggers. An environmental group in Germany was fighting industrial pollution. A scientific network in Japan was studying ocean temperatures.
And they were just communicating via slow, expensive mail.
Mail or maybe occasional academic journals. They were fighting localized battles against isolated targets.
The friction of distance kept them fragmented.
Precisely. And the 1992 Earth Summit shattered that friction.
Wow.
Because it wasn't just a meeting of state leaders. It hosted a massive parallel NGO forum known as the Global Forum.
So it gave them a physical space.
A physical space where tens of thousands of activists, scientists, and indigenous leaders just converged. It forced them to sit in the same rooms.
And share their localized data.
Right, and they realized they were fighting different tentacles of the exact same global phenomena.
Oh, wow. So they forged common platforms.
They shared tactical playbooks, built personal relationships. It birthed the modern transnational advocacy network.
They realized that to fight global capital and global environmental degradation, they had to operate globally.
Exactly.
But networking alone doesn't grant you political power. You need leverage.
You do.
And looking at the economic history of the 1980s and 90s in the text, it seems like the states themselves practically handed civil society that leverage.
Through privatization, yes. This is the second crucial element of the perfect storm.
Because the dominant economic ideology was neoliberalism.
Right. Championed by figures like Reagan and Thatcher in the West and enforced globally by the IMF and the World Bank, the core tenet was that the state should shrink.
Sell off state-owned enterprises, privatize public utilities.
And most importantly, the state dramatically reduced its role in providing social welfare.
They just retreated from the public sphere.
They systematically dismantled the public safety net.
Yeah.
And this created a massive vacuum in service provision.
Especially in the developing world, right? Where these structural adjustment programs forced governments to slash health and education budgets just to pay off foreign debt.
Yes. And who stepped into that void? Civil society organizations.
This is a critical mechanical shift. They went from being activists waving signs to being the actual infrastructure of society.
They really did.
I mean, if the government closes a rural health clinic to balance its budget, and Doctors Without Borders or a Catholic charity opens a clinic in the same building, the NGO suddenly possesses immense practical power.
Because they aren't just advocating anymore. They're keeping the population alive.
That embeds them so deeply into the fabric of the community that the state eventually has to rely on them.
That is the exact mechanism. They subcontracted the functions of the state. NGOs became these massive logistical operations handling hundreds of millions in development aid,
Delivering food, running schools.
managing public health crises. And this granted them undeniable legitimacy. I mean, when you are the one delivering the cholera vaccines, you have a much stronger position to demand a seat at the table when global health policies are being written.
Obviously. And while all of this physical and economic restructuring was happening, the technological landscape completely inverted.
The internet arrived.
The ultimate force multiplier.
Yeah. We talked about the physical convergence at the Rio Summit. The internet digitized that convergence and made it instantaneous.
And permanent. Let's look at how that actually changes the tactical reality on the ground. Before the internet, coordinating a multinational protest required months of planning, right? Expensive international phone calls, massive logistical overhead.
It was a nightmare to organize.
But the internet drops the cost of global coordination to effectively zero.
Almost instantly.
A local activist fighting a mining corporation in Indonesia can instantly share internal corporate memos with a legal NGO in London.
Who can then organize a media campaign with activists in New York to pressure the corporation's shareholders.
They bypass the slow, state-controlled media entirely.
A classic early example from the text is the Zapatista uprising in Mexico in 1994.
Oh, right. Tell us about that.
It was an indigenous rebellion in the remote region of Chiapas against the North American Free Trade Agreement.
NAFTA.
Right. Now, militarily, the Mexican government could have crushed them in days.
Easily.
But the Zapatistas utilized early internet networks to instantly broadcast their manifestos and updates to sympathetic human rights groups and student networks globally.
So within days, you had massive protests erupting in front of Mexican embassies around the world.
Exactly. The internet allowed a localized, marginalized group to instantly summon a protective global shield of civil society.
Which forced the Mexican government to halt a full military offensive and actually enter negotiations.
It fundamentally shifted the balance of asymmetrical warfare. The state had the guns, but the network had the information and the speed.
And this model of transnational networking led to some staggering policy victories. The sources highlight the Jubilee 2000 campaign and the Ottawa Mine Ban Treaty.
Both incredible examples.
Let's dig into the mechanics of those because they prove how powerful this dark matter can be. Start with Jubilee 2000.
So Jubilee 2000 is just a masterclass in transnational organizing. Throughout the 80s and 90s, many post-colonial nations in the Global South were suffocating under unpayable sovereign debt.
Spending massive percentages of their GDP just to pay the interest on loans to Western banks and the IMF.
Right. It was a highly technical, deeply entrenched financial reality that most people in the developed world completely ignored.
Because it's boring. How do you make the average citizen care about sovereign debt restructuring?
You utilize a massive, diverse coalition and a brilliant framing strategy. Jubilee 2000 brought together an incredibly disparate network.
Like who?
Progressive labor unions, environmentalists, international development NGOs like Oxfam, and crucially, global faith-based organizations.
Ah, the faith-based groups.
Yes, they leaned into the biblical concept of the Jubilee year, a time when all debts are forgiven and slaves are freed.
So they took a dry macroeconomic issue and reframed it as a profound moral crisis.
Exactly. They mobilized rock stars like Bono to lobby politicians. They organized a human chain of 70,000 people around the G8 summit in Birmingham in 1998.
Wow.
And they gathered 24 million signatures on a global petition.
They just overwhelmed the financial institutions with a multi-front assault of pop culture, moral authority, and sheer demographic weight.
And it worked. They forced the IMF, the World Bank, and creditor governments to cancel over $100 billion of debt owed by the world's poorest countries.
That is staggering. And the Ottawa mine ban followed a similar logic of bypassing traditional gridlock, right?
It did.
Mm-hmm.
For decades, attempts to ban anti-personnel landmines were stalled in the UN's Conference on Disarmament
Wow.
because the rules required consensus, meaning any single powerful state could veto the ban.
Oh, that's impossible.
Right. So the international campaign to ban landmines, which was a network of over 1,000 NGOs, realized the traditional system was designed to fail.
So they just left.
They partnered with a group of sympathetic states, led by Canada, to step completely outside the UN machinery.
They created a fast-track diplomatic process, the Ottawa process.
Exactly, where states could negotiate and sign a ban treaty without the veto power holding them back.
They recognized that the architecture of global governance was broken, so they simply built a new house. They circumvented the bureaucratic maze of the UN.
And this leads directly to the core structural flaw that these groups are constantly fighting against.
Which is
the crisis of transnational exclusion.
transnational exclusion. Okay, let's unpack that.
This is the fundamental friction in the modern world order. As the global economy integrated, issues became inherently transnational.
Right, a financial collapse in U.S. housing markets instantly devastates economies in Europe and Asia.
Or carbon emissions from factories in China alter the climate for farmers in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
Because the problems cross borders, the governance of these problems had to cross borders.
And that led to the rise of massive global regulatory bodies, the WTO, the IMF, the G8.
Exactly. But the people running these organizations are utterly insulated from the consequences of their decisions.
I mean, if you're a bureaucrat sitting in a boardroom in Geneva drafting an intellectual property agreement for the WTO.
You aren't the one who will suddenly lose access to affordable, generic HIV medication in South Africa.
Exactly. The people who suffer the consequences have zero mechanism to hold the decision makers accountable.
That is transnational exclusion in a nutshell. In a domestic nation state, if the government passes a terrible law, The citizens have structural mechanisms to fight back.
They can vote the politicians out, they can challenge the law in a nonpartisan constitutional court.
They can leverage parliamentary oversight.
But the global governance bodies have none of those mechanisms. There
Yes.
are no global elections.
Right.
There is no Supreme Court of the WTO that a citizen can appeal to.
Which creates a massive, glaring legitimacy gap. The global institutions wield the power of a state, but lack the democratic legitimacy of a state.
And by the late 1990s and early 2000s, this legitimacy gap was causing intense friction.
Massive, violent protests at WTO meetings in Seattle and G8 meetings in Genoa.
The institutions realized that if they didn't adapt, their entire model of global governance would lose credibility.
So they were forced to seek out civil society to borrow their grassroots legitimacy.
They realized it was safer to invite the protesters inside the tent than to have them constantly trying to burn it down.
Precisely. The institutions began developing closer, formalized relations with civil society organizations to show that they were inclusive and attentive to demands coming from below.
The sources point to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization's Committee on World Food Security as a prime example of this.
Yes, that's a huge one.
How does that look mechanically? Do the NGOs actually get a vote?
The structure is highly deliberate. The committee underwent a major reform to intentionally reserve seats for a wide variety of non-state actors.
So they created specific mechanisms for civil society organizations.
Social movements representing smallholder farmers, indigenous peoples, research centers, and even private sector associations to sit alongside government reps.
But wait, what's their actual power?
Now, their role is predominantly consultative. They do not have the final voting power to pass binding resolutions.
Okay, so I am deeply skeptical of this dynamic.
I figured you might be.
It feels like a brilliant tactical maneuver by the global elite. Think about it. If I'm running a global institution and my policies are deeply unpopular, I give an NGO a consultative seat.
Right.
I let them complain on the record. Then I pass the exact same policy I was going to pass anyway, but now I can stamp it with a seal of civil society consultation.
The institution launders its reputation through the NGO.
Exactly. And worse, the architecture of these institutions is incredibly fluid. The second civil society figures out how to exert pressure on a specific body, the states just restructure the organization to neutralize the threat.
You are describing the precise mechanism of institutional evasion, and it happens constantly.
Give me an example from the text.
The classic example is the shift in global economic governance following the 2008 financial crisis.
The move from the G8 to the G20.
Correct. For decades, the primary forum for coordinating the global economy was the G8, a small, concentrated group of wealthy, industrialized nations.
And transnational activists had mastered the art of engaging with the G8.
They knew how to pressure specific finance ministers, coordinate counter summits, dominate the media narrative. Their entire global network was optimized to target the G8.
Let's use an analogy here to understand how devastating that shift was for them. It's exactly like corporate restructuring designed to bust a labor union.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right. Imagine a union spends a decade organizing a massive auto manufacturing plant. They finally get 100% union density, they have leverage, they threaten a strike.
And what does management do?
Management simply responds by permanently closing the plant, merging the operations into 3 different non-union facilities across different countries, and changing the name of the parent company.
Wow, yeah.
The union didn't lose the fight, the battlefield itself was deleted.
That is exactly what happened. In 2009, as the financial crisis spiraled, the major powers elevated the G20 to be the premier forum for international economic cooperation.
Which included the original G8 states, but added emerging economies like China, India, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil.
Which fundamentally changes the geography of power.
Entirely. Suddenly, the activists' carefully constructed networks were obsolete. They were now dealing with a much larger, more diffuse entity.
Furthermore, the G20 included powerful authoritarian states where domestic civil society was heavily suppressed.
Making it incredibly difficult for activists to build the same kind of coordinated cross-border pressure they had used against the democratic states of the G8.
The civil society networks were left lagging behind. They had to completely rebuild their institutional filters, adapt to new diplomatic realities, and find new pressure points.
The target didn't just move, its molecular structure changed.
Exactly.
So if the system is inherently designed to exclude them, to launder their legitimacy, or to constantly shift out from under them, how do these grassroots groups force their way in and actually create material change?
It's tough.
How do you beat a system that owns the board and writes the rules? The sources outline a very specific three-step playbook that civil society uses to alter the trajectory of global politics.
They do. And the core concept of this playbook relies on understanding what civil society actually produces.
What do they produce?
Well, they don't merely act as problem solvers like delivering vaccines or managing refugee camps when the state fails. Their most profound power lies in acting as problem generators.
Problem generators? That sounds counterintuitive. Most people assume the goal of global politics is to solve problems, not create them.
But you cannot solve a problem until society acknowledges that the problem exists. For a situation to become a political issue, it must first be defined as one.
So they fight normative battles over the fundamental interpretation of reality.
Yes. They take the situation that the world has accepted as a natural, unchangeable fact of life, and they generate a problem out of it, forcing it onto the international agenda.
Which brings us to step one of the playbook, conceptualization and framing. What's the mechanism behind this?
This is the process of epistemic disruption. A transnational network must present an issue in such a way that the global public suddenly perceives it as problematic, urgent, and crucially soluble.
Soluble, that's the key word.
Because if people believe a situation is a tragedy but impossible to change, they will feel pity, but they will not act. You have to convince them that the architecture of reality can be altered.
The sources use the profound historical example of the suffragette movement to illustrate this epistemic shift.
The fight for women's suffrage is the perfect anchor for this.
Because if you look at human history prior to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the subordinate role of women wasn't widely debated as a political injustice by the ruling class.
No, it was viewed through the lens of theology, biology, and natural law. It was simply the way things are.
It wasn't a problem to be solved, it was the baseline reality of human civilization.
Exactly. So the suffragettes didn't just demand a vote. They had to completely dismantle the prevailing epistemological framework of society. They had to produce new knowledge.
They engaged in conceptualization, framing the traditional subordinate role of women not as a natural biological given, but as a constructed gross injustice.
And they paired that framing with a clear egalitarian replacement, universal suffrage. They generated a profound political problem out of a reality that had been unquestioned for centuries.
That framing, naming the invisible cage and demanding the key, is the mandatory first step.
Mandatory, yes.
But framing alone is just philosophy. I can frame a brilliant argument about global inequality in my living room, but it won't change international law.
Sadly, no.
That requires step two, dissemination. And this is where the friction gets intense, because the sources suggest they have to merge two incredibly different modes of communication, science and spectacle.
Right, dissemination is about externalizing the new knowledge and forcing the public to confront it. And you are correct about the dual approach. First, activist networks must secure cognitive legitimacy.
By collaborating with scientists, academics, legal experts,
Publishing white papers, conducting peer-reviewed environmental studies, gathering hard epidemiological data. When civil society channels its claims through the language of science, it becomes incredibly difficult for the state to dismiss them as merely emotional or radical.
but there is a massive friction there.
What's that?
Science is inherently slow, nuanced, filled with caveats, and frankly, boring to the general public.
Yeah.
You cannot mobilize 1 million people to march in the streets based on a 400-page statistical analysis of atmospheric carbon concentrations.
Which is why the science must be weaponized through public spectacle.
Ah.
Dissemination requires capturing the public's imagination and generating moral outrage. This is where mass protests, civil disobedience, boycotts, and highly publicized media stunts come in.
The network uses the scientific data to prove to the policymakers that they are factually correct.
And they use the mass protests to prove to the politicians that the public actually cares enough to punish them if they don't act.
You need the rigor of the laboratory combined with the theater of the street.
Perfectly said.
Okay, so you've framed the problem. You've published the peer-reviewed data. You have 10,000 people marching outside the UN headquarters. But if I am a cynical UN bureaucrat, I can look out the window, acknowledge the protest, and still completely ignore them. I can simply claim those 10,000 people are a radical fringe group. They do not represent the silent majority of my country.
And that is the ultimate barrier, which brings us to step 3, representation.
This addresses the fundamental crisis of legitimacy in civil society.
Yes, the network must answer the most dangerous question posed by those in power.
Yeah.
Whose name do you speak?
If you are an environmental NGO based in London, heavily funded by European donors, and you are demanding the cessation of logging in the Amazon rainforest, who do you actually represent?
Right.
Do you represent the global climate? Do you represent the indigenous tribes who live in the forest? Or do you represent the economic interests of the global north trying to restrict the development of the global south?
That is the exact vulnerability states will exploit to delegitimize a movement. To successfully promote change, the transnational network must gain a recognized role in the public sphere as a rightful, authentic advocate of general interests.
They must successfully claim to represent a broad, affected constituency.
And that constituency must publicly validate that representation. They have to build undeniable coalitions that cross geographic and class lines.
Once they establish that undeniable representative legitimacy, they acquire the political capital necessary to sit at the negotiating table and force concessions.
Exactly.
Okay, so the mechanics of that playbook are incredibly solid, but it assumes that the activists operate in a system that at least allows for public dissent.
Yeah, a democratic system.
Right. If we think about how this actually applies to the real world, we have to recognize that many national governments will not tolerate this playbook. They will aggressively suppress the framing, outlaw the dissemination, and imprison the representatives.
Happens all the time.
So what is the tactical maneuver when a domestic government completely shuts off the valve of civil society?
When the domestic road is blocked, activists deploy a structural maneuver known as the boomerang effect.
The boomerang effect.
This model, famously conceptualized by political scientists Margaret Keck and Catherine Sickink, explains how local activists bypass the state entirely.
Okay, give me a scenario.
Imagine a scenario where an authoritarian regime is violently displacing an indigenous minority group to build a massive hydroelectric dam.
Okay.
The local activists try to protest, but the state controls the media, bans public assembly, and begins arresting the organizers. The domestic political system is completely closed.
So the local group has zero leverage against the state.
None. So they throw the issue outward into the transnational arena.
How do they do that?
The local activists smuggle data, photographs, and testimonies out of the country and share them with international NGOs based in democratic states, say Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch in New York or London.
They shift the battlefield from the closed domestic sphere to the open international sphere.
Exactly. Now the international NGOs take over the dissemination. They use their vast resources to launch global media campaigns. They lobby their own democratic governments like the US or the UK, and they pressure international bodies like the World Bank, which might be funding the dam.
So the issue is broadcast globally.
And then the pressure boomerangs back locally. The US government threatens sanctions, the World Bank threatens to pull the funding, and international media creates a PR nightmare for the authoritarian regime.
The local activists lacked the power to punch the regime directly, so they networked with a global heavyweight who could punch downward on their behalf.
It is a brilliant bypass of state sovereignty.
You know, let's actually run a quick simulation here. For the HF Dissen Gymnasium students tuning in to make this super concrete, I want you to put on the hat of, say, a representative for a Danish civil society organization. Maybe someone working on international aid or human rights, like, say, the Danish Refugee Council or Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke down in Brussels.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can play that role.
Awesome. So as this Danish civil society organizer, how do you actually try to influence, the Danish government or the EU when a crisis hits?
Well, speaking as the NGO rep, first, we do our homework. If there's a crisis in the global south, we deploy our field researchers to gather verifiable, on-the-ground data. We don't just rely on what the local authoritarian government is saying. We bring that hard data back to Copenhagen or Brussels.
So that's the science part of the dissemination.
Exactly. Then we use our formalized relationships. We sit down with officials from DANIDA, the Danish International Development Agency, or members of the Folketing, the Danish parliament. We say, look, here is the proof of human rights abuses. You cannot continue funding this specific state program.
And what if the Danish politicians just politely ignore you? What if it's politically inconvenient for them to act?
Then we move to the spectacle. We partner with Danish media outlets. We organize public awareness campaigns across Nordic universities, maybe stage a peaceful demonstration outside Christiansborg. We generate public outrage so that the voters start calling their representatives. We make it politically costly for them to ignore us.
Fascinating. And how do you see your role in relation to broader EU foreign policy? Do you feel like you actually have power there?
Definitely. Denmark is a small state, but it has a strong normative voice in the EU regarding human rights and green transition. By influencing the Danish foreign minister's stance, we can indirectly shape how the entire EU votes at the UN. We act as a critical friend to the government. We hold them to their own democratic values when they might be tempted by, say, short-term trade deals.
Okay, stepping out of the simulation, that was great. It really grounds the theory.
Glad it helped.
But gaining this level of global influence networking with international heavyweights and wielding the power to threaten a state's economy or an EU vote, that places these organizations on a razor's edge.
It does. It's incredibly dangerous.
Once you prove you have power, the establishment will react. The sources detail two extreme dangers that civil society faces when engaging with mainstream politics: the trap of co-optation and the violence of ostracization.
Right. Operating in the political mainstream is inherently dangerous for a group whose entire mandate is to challenge the status quo.
Let's examine the mechanics of co-optation first.
It's essentially a process of institutional capture. Civil society organizations require three things to survive: financial resources, public recognition, and access to policymakers.
And governments and massive international organizations control the tap for all three.
Exactly. But they do not distribute these resources blindly.
They use their financial leverage to domesticate the threat.
Precisely. The institutional system is incredibly savvy. Faced with thousands of NGOs demanding change, a government or a body like the EU will selectively pick and choose to fund and legitimize only the convenient groups.
Convenient in what way?
They look for organizations whose goals are already somewhat aligned with the state's moderate reform agenda, or groups that focus purely on technical service delivery rather than radical political change.
So the state throws millions of dollars in grant money at a moderate environmental NGO to run a recycling awareness campaign.
Right.
The NGO gets funding, they get to hire staff, they get invited to the climate summit, and they feel like they are winning. But the state is using them instrumentally.
The state points to the NGO and says, look, we are partnering with civil society, we have massive grassroots support, all while continuing to subsidize the fossil fuel industry.
The NGO has been hollowed out, they lose their independence, they mute their criticism so they don't lose next year's grant, and they become a subsidized PR wing for the state. They have been entirely co-opted.
We even see the rise of NGOs.
Wait, NGOs? What is that?
Government-organized, non-governmental organizations.
That is an oxymoron.
It is. They are literal shell companies set up by authoritarian regimes to mimic civil society at international conferences. They sit in the civil society seats, but they just echo the government's talking points.
That is wild. It is the velvet glove of state control. But if an organization refuses the funding, refuses to moderate its demands, and takes a hard oppositional stance against the material power structures of the state, they face the iron fist, the danger of ostracization.
Yes. This is where the state utilizes its monopoly on violence and law. If you genuinely threaten the economic interests of a powerful state, they don't invite you to a summit. They criminalize your existence.
We see this constantly, right?
All the time. Groups that demand radical redistribution of land or environmental groups that physically block fossil fuel infrastructure are systematically marginalized. The state utilizes its legal apparatus to strip them of legitimacy.
The text mentions the post-9/11 security paradigm.
Right. Yes. Many states weaponized broad anti-terrorism laws to target domestic civil society. Environmental activists are charged with domestic eco-terrorism. Indigenous land defenders are labeled as violent insurgents or mafias.
By legally classifying these groups as criminals, the state signals to the international community and the media that these actors are outside the bounds of acceptable political discourse. They are ostracized.
Exactly.
This leads to a profoundly unsettling historical observation from the text. The very label of civil is entirely ideological.
Oh, absolutely.
It is not an objective metric of human rights or morality. It's a normative classification written by whoever currently holds hegemonic power. The word civil just means acceptable to the current regime.
And the sources point to the historical treatment of Nelson Mandela and Yasser Arafat as the ultimate proof of this shifting legitimacy.
It is the most striking irony of international relations. If we look at the 1970s and 1980s, the African National Congress, led by Nelson Mandela, was actively fighting to dismantle the brutal state-sponsored apartheid regime in South Africa.
Yet the mainstream global powers, including the United States and the United Kingdom, officially designated Mandela and the ANC as terrorists.
They were the definition of ostracized. They were criminalized for using armed resistance against a violent state.
Similarly, Yasser Arafat and the Palestine Liberation Organization were universally condemned by Western powers as a criminal terrorist organization.
But the geopolitical tectonic plates shifted. The Cold War ended. The moral horror of apartheid became impossible for the West to defend.
And as the ideological needs of the global hegemony changed, the classification of these men completely inverted.
The terrorists were rebranded as the ultimate statesmen. Both Mandela and Arafat were eventually awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. They went from being the absolute targets of state violence to the celebrated pillars of global civil society.
It proves that the lines of global legitimacy are drawn in sand. An organization considered an existential threat to the state in one decade can be championed as the vanguard of human rights in the next, simply because the predominant ideology shifted.
The label of civil society is a battleground in itself.
It really is.
Okay, we have unpacked a massive amount of theory. We've examined the structural lenses, the historical perfect storm of the 90s, the crisis of transnational exclusion, the mechanical playbook of framing and the boomerang effect, and the existential dangers of co-optation and criminalization.
That's a lot of ground covered.
To see how every single one of these gears turns together in a real-world scenario, the sources provide a detailed case study. And it is arguably one of the most successful, methodical civil society campaigns of the modern era.
The push for a global moratorium on the death penalty.
Yes. This campaign perfectly illustrates the architecture of a transnational network moving from local mobilization to global norm creation.
It didn't begin with a sudden, massive vote at the UN. It followed a rigorous, multi-stage process of normative promotion that utilized the exact playbook we just discussed.
Let's trace the mechanics of the campaign. Where does the origin point start and how does it scale?
The initial spark occurred in a highly specific national context. In this case, the mobilization began in Italy in the mid-1990s. Organizations like the Community of Sant'Egidio and Hands Off Cain began building a strong domestic foundation. They lobbied the Italian government, engaged the public, and secured domestic political consensus.
But they knew that abolishing the death penalty in Italy did nothing for the thousands of people facing execution globally.
Right. They had to trigger the boomerang effect and scale upward.
So they went transnational. They built the network.
They utilized the new communication technologies and the post-Cold War openness to network with massive international heavyweights, specifically Amnesty International, which had vast resources and global reach.
They merged their localized passion with Amnesty's transnational logistical infrastructure.
Exactly. They formed the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. Once the network was globalized, they shifted to leverage politics.
Systematically targeting specific states that were resistant to the idea.
Using diplomatic pressure, public shaming, and leveraging economic ties to persuade them to back the cause. Finally, having built an undeniable multinational coalition, they took the fight directly to the core machinery of global governance, the United Nations General Assembly.
But the UN General Assembly is a brutal diplomatic arena. Getting 193 nations to agree on anything, let alone restricting their own sovereign right to execute prisoners, requires a masterclass in framing.
It really does.
The sources detail the exact tactics they used, which they termed humanitarian diplomacy. They deployed a two-pronged attack, reason-based framing and emotion-based framing. Let's break down the logic trap of reason-based framing first.
So reason-based framing targets the legal and diplomatic architecture of the state. The activists didn't just argue that the death penalty was bad.
That's too simple.
Right. They persuasively attached the issue to other universally accepted international human rights agendas. They utilized international law against itself. They argued before the UN that if the international community has already ratified the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which guarantees the fundamental right to life,
Okay.
and if the community universally condemns torture as a violation of international law, then logically, state-sponsored execution must be recognized as the ultimate violation of those pre-existing commitments.
Oh, that's brilliant. They built a rigorous, rational, legal framework. They forced states into a corner where opposing the moratorium meant contradicting their other human rights treaties.
They used the state's own legal architecture against it.
But reason alone rarely secures the votes of cynical diplomats. You need moral velocity. And that is where the emotion-based framing provided the overwhelming pressure.
Exactly. While the lawyers argued the statutes, the civil society networks generated profound human empathy.
Bypassing the sterile statistics of the criminal justice system.
By disseminating powerful personal narratives, they brought exonerated death row inmates people who are hours away from being executed for crimes they didn't commit,
Mhm.
to speak directly to UN delegates and the global media.
They shared the agonizing accounts of the families of those on death row, and even the testimonies of former executioners who were psychologically destroyed by their jobs.
They gave the abstract legal debate a deeply human, undeniable face.
And the combination of the airtight legal trap and the overwhelming moral empathy worked. The sheer diplomatic grind culminated in a historic moment.
In 2007, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution calling for a global moratorium on capital punishment.
It is an incredibly empowering case study. We began this deep dive discussing the terrifying, overwhelming power of nation-states, militaries, and multinational corporations. But the mechanics of this campaign prove that organized citizens armed with nothing but strategy, legal reasoning, and human empathy can literally rewire the operating system of international human rights.
They altered the behavior of sovereign states without firing a weapon or winning a single election.
It is an undeniable triumph of the global civil society model. However, as we synthesize the total impact of this dark matter over the last few decades, the sources require us to maintain a critical, objective view.
Yes, we have to look at the whole picture.
Because while the victories are profound, the overall impact of global civil society on the international system has been both modest and structurally uneven.
Let's summarize the undeniable structural victories first, though.
Let's do a quick recap. 3 key takeaways for our listeners, especially the students. What is the first major insight?
Number one, what global civil society is and isn't. It is not just NGOs delivering aid. It is a complex web of problem generators that define global norms and act as the conscience of the international system, demanding transparency from institutions that operate behind closed doors.
Excellent. Takeaway 2.
How it complements and challenges states. It steps in to provide services when the state retreats, but it also uses tools like the boomerang effect to bypass authoritarian governments, holding sovereign states accountable to international law.
And takeaway 3. Why should students and practitioners pay attention to this in foreign policy debates?
Because of the lingering imbalance, this is crucial. Transnational activism is still overwhelmingly dominated by Western organizations based in New York, Geneva, and Brussels. This means the agendas they pursue are heavily influenced by Northern perspectives, leaving the Global South to implement rather than lead the strategic agenda.
Which means entire regions of the globe remain socially disconnected islands. Vast areas in Russia, China, parts of the Middle East, and significant portions of Africa remain isolated from this transnational web, often due to severe state suppression.
Exactly. The political results achieved by global civil society exhibit a severe geopolitical imbalance.
The systems designed to fight structural inequality must constantly guard against replicating it within their own ranks.
A very necessary warning.
Before we wrap up, just a quick reminder that if you found this deep dive valuable, the Patreon link is in the description. You can get those weekly and monthly Danish politics briefings and support the show.
We really appreciate the support.
And as we bring this deep dive to a close, I want to leave you with a final theoretical provocation, a concept that builds on the mechanics we've explored today, but looks toward an incredibly uncertain future.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
We've established that the entire playbook of civil society, from the Rio Earth Summit to the Jubilee 2000 protests, has relied on human convergence. It relies on shared physical spaces, the slow building of human trust, and the profound power of human empathy, like the stories of the exonerated death row inmates.
The human element, the friction of human organizing, has been the absolute core of the structural playbook.
So what happens to global civil society when we remove the human friction? We are entering the age of artificial intelligence and decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs.
Right.
If an algorithmic network can organize capital globally via blockchain, completely bypassing the international banking system, and if generative AI can synthesize data, draft legal frameworks, and deploy millions of persuasive, hyper-targeted narratives at 1,000,000 times the speed of a human NGO, what happens to the concept of civil society?
It's a daunting question.
Will the next great push for global human rights be led by humans holding signs in the street, negotiating in conference halls? Or will it be led by decentralized, algorithmic swarms operating entirely in the digital ether, completely immune to the co-optation or ostracization of any nation-state?
It fundamentally questions whether the dark matter of global politics will remain human, or if the mechanism of accountability itself will become automated.
And as we observe this invisible web of power quietly rewriting the rules of our world, we have to look closely at the network and wonder exactly who or what will be pulling the strings tomorrow.
It's something to definitely mull over.
For sure. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Make sure you follow the show, and if you enjoyed it, please rate it 5 stars so it can reach even more people. Next time on the summer series, we'll be tackling global political economy. You won't want to miss it.
See you then.
This has been Diplomacy and International Relations. Production and credits are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.